The late afternoon sun drapes the red brick college in a golden haze. Students wander between buildings, some still in gowns, clutching flowers, balloons, the last echoes of celebration trailing behind them. Anya stood at the edge of the quad, just far enough not to be noticed. Her graduation robe, folded and unused, was tucked under her arm like a forgotten souvenir. Her face was calm, but there was a distance in her eyes, the kind that belongs to someone already halfway out the door. She hadn't gone to the after-party. She didn't take a single photo on stage. She hadn't needed any of it. The degree was earned. The rest was noise. The kitchen was small and clean, lived in. A kettle hummed quietly. The smell of warm food, something familiar with dill and boiled potatoes, filled the air. Her father moved with the slow comfort of routine, still in his work overalls. Her mother chopped cucumbers with a rhythm only mothers know. Anya stood by the window, watching birds scatter across a power line. They had congratulated her like good parents do, proud, affectionate, concerned in a gentle way. They wanted to celebrate, but Anya had quietly asked for space. Just a short drive, a few hours. They didn't press. They trusted her, and she knew the weight of that. She filled her car with a calm, practiced motion, the same way she did most things. Her car, a faded red hatchback with peeling stickers and a charm hanging from the mirror, coughed faintly when she started the engine. The road ahead was dark and wide. She hadn't chosen a destination. That was the point. In the passenger seat, her phone screen still glowed from a half-finished post on 9th. She stared at it for a long second, then shut it off. Her fingers drummed lightly against the wheel. The two-lane road curled through patches of forest and empty farmland. Her headlights reached out like thin arms, illuminating nothing and everything. Trees blurred past, their shapes skeletal in the dark. She wasn't thinking of much. That was rare for her. Her mind usually spun in quiet loops, but tonight it was quiet, a kind of earned silence. Then lights, red and blue, flashing behind her. Her chest tightened before she even knew why. She checked her speed. Normal, her hands, steady. The car, fully registered, insured. She pulled to the shoulder with a calm that wasn't entirely real. The patrol car stopped behind her. The lights kept spinning, painting her rearview mirror in bursts of color. She waited. The engine ticked. The night air pressed in. Footsteps approached. The officer's shadow appeared at her window before his face did. She lowered the window halfway. The cold air crept in. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. He said she'd drifted slightly over the line, not speeding, not reckless, just inattentive. He smiled as he said it. Too long, too warm. Anya responded politely, trying to match the tone without encouraging it. She didn't smile. She didn't flirt. Her eyes didn't wander. The air shifted. He asked her to step out of the car. She asked why. Routine, he said. The word fell flat. For a moment she hesitated. Then slowly she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. Her shoes met gravel. The world suddenly felt very quiet. The officer watched her as she stepped into the beam of her own headlights. His posture relaxed, but there was something too casual about it. Too confident. He stood close enough for her to feel his breath catch in the wind. She crossed her arms, said nothing. He tilted his head, smiled again, said something about her being too pretty to be out here alone. It wasn't said like a compliment. It was said like a fact, like a discovery. Anya's weight shifted back, barely, but he saw it. The smile faded. He told her to turn around, hands on the hood. Her heart, steady until now, began to thump. She asked again what this was about. There was no answer this time, only a hand reaching toward her elbow, a push that wasn't rough but wasn't gentle either. The metal of the car's hood was cold against her palms. The lights kept spinning behind her. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. She felt it against her ribs. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just listened, to his breathing, to the static from the radio clipped to his shoulder, to the distant sound of tires in the night. Then the hand moved again, lower. Her palms pressed against the hood, the cold biting into her skin through the fabric of her sleeves. The officer hovered behind her. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. A slow circle, deliberate, like a predator considering how to strike. He spoke again, but it wasn't a question. Something low, something too soft for anyone but her to hear. His tone had lost the practiced smoothness of a public servant. Now it was just private, oily, knowing. His hand touched her lower back, then moved downward. Not a pat-down, not a search. Her eyes locked on the patrol car in front of hers, empty passenger seat. The second officer, wherever he was, wasn't coming. She tensed but didn't flinch. She knew better. Every second mattered now. Every movement could change the shape of this night. The officer's hand crept lower. She heard the breath in his throat quicken. Then his radio crackled. A voice. Male, distracted. Somewhere else. "Everything okay over there?" The officer didn't answer. He reached up and pressed the talk button with one hand, the other still near her waist. "Got it handled." His voice was flat. No warmth, no courtesy, just a wall going up. He released the button. The radio went quiet again. Anya's fingers slid slowly toward her jacket pocket. The officer's weight shifted behind her. He was closer now, too close, his breath near her ear. "Don't scream," he said. "You'll only make it worse." Her fingers found the edge of the phone. Her thumb brushed the side button, not to unlock it, but to press it twice. A silent signal. Her camera began recording. The phone stayed in her pocket. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She just waited. Yaroslav was mid-conversation. A call with someone back home, a teenage son, asking if he could stay out late. He chuckled, gave a warning, hung up. Only then did he notice the time. It had been too long. He adjusted in his seat, glanced in the mirror. The rear patrol lights still spun silently, painting the trees red and blue. But something in his gut moved, a small, hard knot. He keyed his radio again. Kravitz? Status? Nothing. He squinted at the dark stretch of road ahead, then opened the door. Yaroslav stepped into the night air. He was slower than Kravitz, broader, older, the kind of man who'd been a cop too long and had seen enough not to be surprised anymore. But what he saw now made him stop. 50 meters away, his partner's frame was hunched unnaturally against a girl pinned to a car. Her car, a red hatchback, and the girl, he knew that face, even in the dim light. Something in him shifted all at once. He walked faster now. Kravitz didn't hear Yaroslav at first. He was too focused. His hand was flat against Anya's hip now, moving, his breath uneven. She didn't scream. She just whispered, barely audible, "Someone's behind you." Kravitz turned and froze. Yaroslav stood there, expression unreadable, eyes on the two of them. His face was pale beneath the patrol cap. He took a slow step forward. "Kravitz," he said. The name sounded like a warning. Kravitz straightened, hands up now, posture shifting quickly into defense, not guilt but justification. "She was acting nervous," he said. "Didn't cooperate." "I was just." Yaroslav ignored him. His eyes were on Anya. Now he was sure. It was her, the quiet girl from his high school, a decade older now but the same eyes. He remembered watching her from a cafeteria table, too shy to say anything. She'd always been reading something, always alone. He looked at her hands. One was in her jacket pocket. She gave the faintest nod. Yaroslav moved without thinking. The scuffle wasn't long. Kravitz resisted for a few seconds, but Yaroslav was heavier, stronger, and filled with something deeper, fury or shame. It wasn't clear. Kravitz was face down in the dirt, cuffs around his wrists, cursing loudly. All pretense gone. Yaroslav said nothing. He turned to Anya. She pulled the phone from her pocket and stopped the recording. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off. He met her eyes. They didn't speak. The sirens had finally stopped spinning. The air had gone still, almost too quiet. Only the distant buzz of cicadas remained. Kravitz sat on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back, spitting curses into the dirt. Yaroslav stood a few feet away, back turned to him, as though already erasing him from his mental picture. He was staring at Anya. She stood beside her car now, brushing gravel from her jacket. Her composure was cracked but not broken. A tension still lived in her shoulders, the kind that doesn't vanish with the danger. It lingers, rots. Yaroslav looked down at his own hands. They trembled slightly. He hadn't planned to do this tonight. Not to his partner. Not after 15 years on the force, but the line had been crossed, and no training manual had told him what to do with the look he saw in Anya's eyes. It wasn't fear. It was something colder, something final. She stepped forward, holding out her phone. "I recorded it," she said quietly. Yaroslav nodded once. That was all. Kravitz was shoved in the back, still squirming, still barking about internal affairs and department lawyers. His voice bounced uselessly off the reinforced glass. Yaroslav didn't look at him. Anya sat in the front passenger seat, her phone resting on her thigh. She stared ahead, eyes locked on the curve of road where it had all started. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, jaw set. She wasn't talking. Yaroslav didn't ask her to. The dash camera had caught none of it. Kravitz had accidentally turned it off, a violation by itself, but the phone in her jacket had recorded the rest. Clear audio. Clear enough to burn everything down. The lobby buzzed with fluorescent light and sleep-deprived silence. A lone sergeant behind the desk blinked as they walked in, recognizing both men instantly, one in uniform, one in cuffs. Yaroslav filled out the report in hard, efficient strokes. His statement was short and formal. Kravitz was taken away, still spitting venom. Anya didn't stay. She had no reason to. Her room was small and neat, a thin stack of books by the bed, a corkboard with pinned quotes. A laptop left open, her blog draft blinking at the top of the screen. Anya sat cross-legged in front of it, hair tied back, face clean and pale in the blue light of dawn. She uploaded the recording to 9th, no edits, no captions, just the raw file and one sentence typed above it. This is what happened to me last night. She clicked post, closed the laptop, laid down on her back and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the sun touched the rooftops of her quiet town like it always had. The world hadn't changed, but it was about to. In Anya's room. Mid-morning, the laptop screen blinked with notifications. Comments, reposts, private messages flooding in. Some were furious. Some were afraid. Some just said, "I believe you." She read in silence. Not all of them, not yet. Her face gave nothing away, not pride, not relief, just endurance, like she was holding her breath for something worse. Her phone buzzed again. Hundreds of times now. It was spreading faster than she'd expected, faster than she was ready for, but she didn't reach to stop it. The station was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that sets in before the explosion. Yaroslav sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the screen of his department computer. His inbox blinked with messages from internal affairs, from the press, from officers he'd known for years. One email subject line read, "Control the narrative before she does." He didn't open it. A junior officer passed by, gave him a look, not hostile, not friendly, just uncertain. That unsettled Yaroslav more than anything else. Across the room, two senior officers huddled around a phone, whispering. They didn't call him over. His phone buzzed. Again. This time he picked it up. A small, narrow cafe, not far from the center of town. The kind of place where everyone knew each other by name. Anya sat at a corner table, wearing a baseball cap low over her eyes. She sipped tea slowly while watching the notifications roll in. The post had been up for 5 hours. Already a few thousand shares. She opened her inbox. One message stood out, from someone with only a handful of followers, no profile picture. "He did the same to my sister last summer. She didn't say anything. We thought it was over. I'm sorry." She read it 3 times. Then another came. "He said the same thing to me, same road." And another, "My friend. 2021. She left town after." Each one made her sit straighter. Each one made her colder. Yaroslav walked past the break room. The TV was on. A news anchor spoke in sharp tones. Viral video raising questions about local enforcement practices. Allegations dating back years now resurfacing. He didn't stop to watch. In the hallway, he passed Kravitz's locker, now emptied. The nameplate scratched, the inside stripped bare. A new officer stood beside it, pretending not to notice Yaroslav. He kept walking. The town didn't look any different. Cars moved, shops opened, people swept sidewalks and refilled coffee pots. But under the surface, everything was tilting. People looked at uniforms a little longer. Some lowered their eyes. Others didn't. In the school parking lot, 2 teenage girls huddled over a phone, watching the video with wide eyes. One of them whispered something, then nodded, then clicked share. The sun was low. Her room glowed in amber light. Anya sat at her desk again. This time she was writing. A new post. No anger in her tone. Just facts, names, patterns, years. She hit publish. Her following doubled by the hour. The station wasn't operating normally. Phones rang longer before being picked up. Doors stayed shut longer than usual. Conversations stopped when Yaroslav entered a room. He could feel it, the shift. Not open hostility yet, but the tightening of ranks, the growing suspicion, not of Kravitz, of him. He watched as 2 officers reviewed body cam footage from another case, whispering. The screen showed a dark road, a girl crying. The audio was choppy. He didn't ask. They didn't explain. A heavy door closed behind him. A woman in plain clothes, Captain Kovalyuk, sat behind a desk stacked with documents. She didn't smile. She asked questions, not about Kravitz, about Anya, about how he knew her, how close they were, why he got involved. Each word was weighted, framed. Yaroslav answered plainly. He saw something wrong. He acted. She nodded, wrote nothing down. Another message. This one came from a verified account, a large following, a profile photo of a girl in her mid-20 seconds with sharp eyes and a scar just visible near her jaw. Anya opened it cautiously. He did the same to me in 2019. I never said anything. I have his voice on tape. My lawyer told me to drop it. I didn't. I just hid it. I still have the file. Attached was a compressed audio clip. Low quality, but clear enough. Same voice, same phrases, same threat. Anya sat back in her chair. The room around her seemed to fade. She closed the message, began typing. Yaroslav sat in his vehicle, parked near a riverbank, headlights off, engine silent. He looked out over the dark water, chewing the inside of his cheek, thinking. His phone buzzed once. A notification. Anya's new post. He opened it. A new wave of comments. A new file uploaded. The audio from 2019. The same words he'd heard just days ago, nearly verbatim. And this time, it wasn't just shares. It was anger, real anger, and names, other women tagging each other, connecting dots, not one case, not two, not even 5. A pattern, years old. And they'd all missed it, or ignored it. Inside the break room, several officers huddled around the same post. Their faces told different stories, some blank, some worried, one or two dark with resentment. One officer shook his head. He's gonna take all of us down. No one disagreed. She poured a glass of water with hands that finally started to shake. Her mother watched from the doorway, eyes shadowed, quiet. She didn't ask what was happening. She just placed a hand on Anya's back, not pressing, not guiding, just resting there. The kind of touch that says, I don't know what you're becoming, but I see you, and I'm not letting go. The building was busier than usual, the wrong kind of busy. Phones rang without pause. Officers moved quickly, quietly. Faces tight, unreadable. No one greeted each other. Yaroslav entered the lobby and walked past the front desk without a word. The receptionist barely glanced up. He felt the weight of their stares even as their eyes remained on their screens. In the briefing room, half a dozen officers sat clustered around a laptop, watching Anya's newest post. One of them swore under his breath. Yaroslav didn't stop. He moved straight toward internal affairs. A cold room, neutral walls. 3 chairs on one side of a table, one on the other. Yaroslav sat alone facing them. The IA captain, the department lawyer, and a city official from the mayor's office. No introductions, no small talk. The city official asked the question directly. Did you witness Officer Kravitz physically assault the woman? Yaroslav didn't blink. Yes. Did you stop him using force? Yes. Was there any resistance from her? No. Do you believe this was an isolated incident? He hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of disgust. No, I don't. There was silence, a long one. The city official leaned back, folding his arms. You understand this puts you in conflict with your department? Yaroslav's voice was flat now. I'm not in conflict with the department's in conflict with itself. He pushed a USB across the table, his own written statement, time-stamped and notarized. Copied twice. The IA captain looked at it like it was a weapon. It was. Kravitz stood behind the glass of a holding cell, arms crossed, hair disheveled, uniform gone. His eyes followed Yaroslav as he walked past. No words exchanged, but the hatred in Kravitz's eyes was loud. The mask was gone. The charm was gone. Only the raw, angry animal underneath remained. Yaroslav didn't look back. The local news played on the small TV in the background. She didn't need to hear it. She'd already read everything. Officer suspended pending investigation. Viral post triggers department review. More women come forward. Anya sat on the floor with her laptop. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Her post had crossed 100,000 shares. More than the video, it was her name. The comments weren't all kind, but she was used to that. She wasn't reading them for kindness. She was reading them for stories, names, dates, years, flashbulbs, reporters. A tight, uncomfortable podium. The mayor stood in front of microphones, flanked by the police chief and city attorney. Their faces were grave, exhausted. We are cooperating fully with the investigation. We are horrified by these allegations. This is not who we are. But the faces behind the cameras were skeptical now. The public had seen too much and believed too little. Internal Affairs archive room, day boxes, folders, discs, all labeled dust-covered, filed in cabinets that hadn't been touched in years. Yaroslav stood in the center of the archive room, watching as two IA officers pulled files from a storage rack. Their faces were pale, serious. The evidence wasn't digital. That had made it easier to forget or ignore. Paper, audio tapes, scanned photos, signatures, each one telling a small story, complaints, dismissals, internal memos marked with red stamps, unfounded, lack of evidence. Victim uncooperative, a name repeated, Kravets, same roads, same types of girls, same phrases in the testimonies, like a script he never bothered to change. They had been warned, more than once. A high-level meeting, closed door, mid-level city lawyers, IA heads, the chief, the mayor's rep, coffee cups, nervous glances, stiff silence. Someone finally said it. He should have been pulled off the road 5 years ago. Another, he never should have been hired. The chief exhaled slowly. No one argued. They knew. The failure wasn't just Kravets. It was the department, the oversight, the incentives to bury scandal, the laziness, the complicity. They hadn't failed to notice him. They'd chosen not to deal with him, and now he'd exposed them all. She read it on a third-party blog first, a leaked memo from a previous IA review, dated 2 years back. A woman had filed a nearly identical complaint. Kravets had been cleared in under a week, no follow-up, no transcript. The case officer had written, "Witness appeared confused, statement lacked clarity." Anya opened the file. The attached transcript, a full hour of audio, was devastatingly clear. The witness hadn't been confused. She'd been terrified, and specific, and ignored. Anya sat across from a woman in her late 30s, nervous, pale, her voice trembling as the microphone blinked red. "He told me no one would believe me, and he was right." She was one of the early ones. Her case had been tossed out in 2016. Anya had found her through a comment thread. Now she was speaking publicly for the first time. The host stayed silent. They didn't need to add anything. The woman's voice, shaking, steady, quiet, did more than any headline. He sat alone, lights off, phone in hand. A message from a retired officer blinked on the screen. He was protected. You know that, right? No greeting, no name, no denial. Just that. Yaroslav put the phone down. The room remained dark. Kravets sat in a separate holding wing now, isolated for his own protection. His face was different, hollowed, like something had been peeled back. He didn't ask for a lawyer anymore. He barely spoke. The guards kept their distance. Even among criminals, his crime was poison. One of them whispered to another as they passed, "You think he'll make it to trial?" The other shrugged. "Doesn't matter. It's already over." The building stood like every other one, concrete, bland, indifferent. But the people crowding the steps were not indifferent. Reporters, cameramen, protesters holding hand-lettered signs, mothers holding daughters' hands too tightly, men with arms crossed watching silently. A few wore uniforms off-duty, out of place. Anya entered through the back, escorted by a court officer. No cameras, no flash. She didn't speak as she walked. She didn't look left or right, only forward. No empty seats, a heavy silence, taut with breath held too long. Kravets sat in his orange jumpsuit, hands shackled at the waist. The smirk he wore during his arraignment was gone. His posture had caved inward. Across the room, Anya sat upright in the witness box. She didn't shake. She read from a page. Not loud, not angry, just factual. She spoke about the night, the hand on her back, the way he leaned too close, the moment she knew that no one was coming. She finished in under 5 minutes. The silence that followed was not one of disbelief. It was one of recognition. The prosecutor didn't elaborate. There was nothing left to clarify. The judge, a woman in her 50s, read from a written judgment. The courtroom heard words like pattern, coercion, breach of trust, systemic failure. Then, sentenced to 20 years without parole. There was no gasp, no cheer, no movement, only the sound of a pen clicking. The judge had finished her signature. Guards approached Kravets. He didn't resist, didn't speak. He left the courtroom exactly as he had entered it, silent, unrepentant, alone. Yaroslav stood across the street, hands in his coat pockets, watching from the shadows. He didn't go inside. He didn't need to. He saw Anya exit through the side gate. For a moment she stopped, looked out at the crowd, then lowered her eyes and walked away. Yaroslav watched her until she disappeared into the city. He never called out. He didn't know what he'd even say. The headline appeared before noon, "Officer sentenced in landmark abuse case." But the real story was in the subheadlines. Victims recording sparks national reckoning. Testimonies now number 47 across 4 counties. Policy reform bill proposed. Civilian review boards mandated. Her name was now attached to something much larger than herself. An empty locker. Yaroslav's nameplate removed. He'd left 2 days before the sentencing. No ceremony, no farewell. He didn't want one. Somewhere far away, the badge sat in a drawer, wrapped in cloth. It was subtle, but visible. A new sign outside the police station, Civilian Oversight Committee, now open to public audits. 2 women in plain clothes entered the station through a separate door, clipboards in hand. The old routines were broken. Resentfully, awkwardly, but broken. The all-male night patrol team had been disbanded. New rules, new faces, female recruits, interview panels that weren't just ceremonial. Small steps, uneven, fragile, but real. The laptop sat closed. The notifications had slowed. Her inbox had grown quiet, a strange relief and an even stranger loss. She no longer posted daily, but when she did, people listened. Anya wasn't trying to be a figurehead. She didn't want it. She hadn't asked for it. But she understood now that her silence, once a shield, had become a weapon, and that she couldn't give it up completely. The chairs were mismatched. The snacks were store-bought. The lighting buzzed faintly overhead. A group of 12 sat in a rough circle, women, mostly, a few teens, 1 man. Anya sat in a folding chair, knees tucked up, a notebook resting on her thigh. She wasn't leading. She was just there, listening. At the front of the room, someone asked a question. "Are you ever afraid they'll come after you now?" A long pause. Anya didn't smile, but her voice was even. "Let them try." A red hatchback cruised slowly down the familiar stretch of highway. The trees looked the same. The air was colder now, but Anya's hands were steady on the wheel. She drove without music, just the engine and the wind and the sound of tires rolling over the earth she now understood far too well. No destination, just forward,